Shall we begin with prayer and
Yes.
then get started? All right, please be with me in prayer. Oh, gracious God, we thank you for this day, for this time together, for the beautiful sunshine, and the chance to be out in it today after we've spent some time together in fellowship and study. We ask for your wisdom, your grace, your guidance as we wrestle with all of the ideas, the pieces of our faith that you've given to us in this book. Be with us today and help us to make that presence felt. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So we're looking at the book of Job today. It's on page 558 in the Old Testament portion. You know, the numbers start over with the New Testament. So 558 is where we'll start. Kind of the impetus for this, I've got a book coming out next year with Oxford University Press called Concerning Dust and Ashes. And I'm looking at how the people in the Bible respond to encounters with God, and then what that's supposed to do to us as readers. And kind of the idea that sometimes the Bible tries to expand our understanding of the world in ways that we might resist with our rational minds. The whole idea of the divine is that the world isn't necessarily how we see it, that our perception is pretty limited. Sometimes it's hard to do that just by telling us something. So sometimes how the Bible works is by making us feel something instead. And by making us feel something, it can get us closer to that. So the book of Job is one of the main books I work with because I kind of think that's what's happening at the end. But it also seems like in order to get there, we need to spend some time kind of going through the book of Job and just talking about what's happening in it. So I thought this session would kind of be our laying the groundwork session where we talk a little bit about the book of Job and about what it is, what happens in it. Because I think the book of Job, it's one I keep returning to in my scholarship because it is rich and fascinating and maddening. Every time you think it does, doesn't it? Every time you think you've got it nailed down and you understand what's happening in it, it undercuts that. It does something a little different than you expect. And I think that's part of what's happening in it. I think that frustration is maybe part of what we're supposed to experience as we go through it. So I thought from there we could kind of just build up a little bit of background about the book of Job. And then when we meet again in 2 weeks, we'll talk about the divine speeches at the end. Because that's supposed to be the answer to everything. But exactly what it answers is... Job spends the whole book saying, God, I need you to come talk to me about how this is just, why I'm experiencing what I'm experiencing. And God finally comes, which is a huge surprise in and of itself, and then gives a long, long speech, God's longest speech in the entire Bible, that seems to be maybe a non sequitur or at least talking about something entirely different. So our work is really, how does that speech connect with what's happening in the book of Job? Just a couple of things of background on the book of Job that I find really fascinating, and then we'll look at the opening of it. So first of all, the structure of this book is really strange. So Job, let's see chapters 1 through 2 are often referred to as the prose prologue. This is where we get kind of the background of the story and the foundation of what's happening. And it's written in really simple prose, like it's almost like a fairy tale. It's straightforward sentences. I teach Hebrew every other year at the seminary in Detroit, and verses 1 through 5 that we're going to read soon are some of the verses I give to my students for like a middle of the year exam, because they're really fairly straightforward and simple in terms of the Hebrew. But then suddenly in chapter 3 we get to poetry. So really verses 3 through 42 verse 6 are all in poetry. So starting in verse 3, we have a poetic lament from Job. Or starting in chapter 3, excuse me. So that shift from prose to poetry is really, really jarring. It's so jarring that some scholars have suggested for centuries that maybe this prose prologue was the original story, and then somebody else, I think I might break my head open on that before the class is done here. Let's see if I can avoid tripping over it. That some scholars have suggested this prose prologue is like the original story, and this is an old folk tale that was told. And then somebody else came along and wrote these poems afterwards, kind of to add on to it. I look at it more like, you remember seeing The Wizard of Oz, the old MGM movie? When we're in Kansas, what does it look like?
Little covered cabin.
You remember this?
Right there underneath the clock.
It's black and white, right? It's black and white, yeah. And then suddenly when we get to Oz, it's in color. It looks completely different all of a sudden. That doesn't mean that we have a different author or that it's a different movie or anything like that. It just means that we're moving into a different world. I kind of feel like that's what's happening with when we move to poetry. Chapters 4 through really 27 are what we might call the wisdom debates. Job and his friends take turns debating each other. Thank you. Job and his friends take turns debating. The friends suggest, here's what's happening, and Job responds. The other friends suggest. They all kind of take turns. And we have several cycles of this. Chapter 28 is a hymn to wisdom. We won't probably talk about that much in this class, but how this fits in with the whole book is, it's not even clear who's speaking. Like, is Job giving this big song about wisdom, or is this the narrator? We're not quite sure. 29 through 31, Job's final speeches. And then if we aren't confused enough, this guy in chapter 32 through 37, this guy named Elihu comes in, and we've never heard of him before. There's been no reference to who he is, and suddenly he comes in and gives his own speech about what's happening. So figuring out how Elihu fits in all this is strange. But what's even more strange is that then at the end, 42:6, God gives a speech. God gives us the answer to everything if only we have the wisdom to unlock it. We've gone from the simplest prose in the Bible. As we get to this divine speech at the end, the Hebrew is probably the most difficult in the Bible. It's full of words that only appear once, that we have to kind of guess what they mean. The constructions, the grammar is really strange. It really has the feeling of that, what you might expect, being overwhelmed and disoriented in front of God. But then when we get to 42:7 to the end, just a few verses, we're back in prose again. So this is when we've returned to Kansas, and we're back in black and white. And that's when everything comes, Job gets everything back and the story resolves itself. So moving from, we have the prose at the beginning, at the end, poetry through most of the book, and largely a series of speeches about the question of wisdom, about the question of justice. Before I talk more, let me ask you, what's your relationship to the book of Job? What are your initial feelings about it, or what have you felt about it over the years? What does the book of Job do to you?
How one man could go through so much.
Job sure goes through a lot.
Does.
Yeah. And it's interesting that we clearly have different traditions about Job. There's one, maybe two references to him in the New Testament. In the book of James, he's referred to as Job the patient, right? And throughout the book, we see in the first two chapters, he's very patient. And then all of a sudden, he's not. He spends 30, almost 35 chapters complaining and arguing and making some pretty dramatic charges against God. He charges God with being his persecutor in many places. So I think we might have grown up hearing this idea of Job the patient, somebody has the patience of Job or something like that, but that's not really borne out with this story. He has a lot to say. But we clearly have seen that he's been through a lot. He goes through a lot. And is that necessarily fair? I think that's one of the big questions of the Bible, right? Because as we're introduced to him, we don't really see a reason for that.
Well, I found it intriguing and frustrating that God picked up the challenge of Satan.
I think we want to make sure we talk about that today, because that is, not only does God pick up the challenge of Satan, Job never knows about this. And after God and Satan have their talk in the beginning, we don't see Satan again for the rest of the book as a character. He's not mentioned again. You would think that if that's what happened, God would say, hey, Job, I know you're probably going to be angry at me. I get it. It wasn't great, but Satan and I had this bet to see how you respond, so this is why all this happened, right? But it's okay now, everything's going back. But that's not what God says. God never tells Job that story that we all know as readers. Job never gets to find out about that. So let's read our introduction to Job in verses 1 through 5. Would someone read just verses 1 through 5 for us?
There once was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts on one another's houses in turn, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offering according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did.
Thank you. I think this passage is deceptively simple. Are you laughing because it doesn't seem simple at all, or there's?
Oh yeah, no, it sounds like a father trying to make up for anything that his children might have done, because he doesn't. He's not real sure that they follow the straight and narrow the way.
That jumped out to you too, huh? That just maybe they've had bad thoughts, or maybe there's something in their heart. So I've got to give offerings every day, just in case.
They might have over-partied.
Yeah.
They might have over-partied. I do notice that when the feast days were done, maybe they were partying a little too hard. But he's blameless and upright, and he fears God. So this guy he's a good guy, right? We don't have any. Do we have any sense of anything negative about him? I feel like the closest we come is what you pulled off, Kathleen. This idea that there might be some anxiety there, right? Some sense of trying to control things a little bit. I almost wonder if is it fair to say that maybe there's a little bit of a lack of trust of his kids? Mm-hmm. Which, we understand. I'm not trying to say he's a bad guy or anything, but if I could do something every day that would make sure that my kids were okay, I would do that too, because I'm anxious about them, right? It may be that my children have sinned. So, what's his social status? What do we know about his social status?
Top of the rung.
He's top of the rung. This is great wealth. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys. He's got got quite a menagerie here, quite a herd. So if I'm trying to put this in our own context, and we heard about a man named John. He was a good man. He did everything right. And then the next thing we read about him is he had 5 Lexuses, 3 mansions, servants to take care of all this, and a couple of vacation homes in South America. I would hear that he's a great man, and I would also think, I'm a little skeptical if he's a great man and when he's got all that stuff. That's a lot of stuff. And we're focusing on this stuff. So for me, I have some doubts kind of creeping in that maybe there's more to the story than meets the eye at first. Just some glimmers of, I wonder.
It also seems that he's concerned about his children, but what about himself?
What about himself? What about everybody else? Yeah, we don't have much of a sense that is he active in the community? What does he do with that great wealth?
Is he generous?
Is he generous?
With others?
We don't
How
know
did he get all this wealth?
How did he get all this wealth?
Well,
Yeah,
he's probably spent his time acquiring it.
probably
Yeah.
spent his time acquiring it. Yeah, that you have to work hard to be able to get this much
That's
stuff.
right.
You'd have to have an awful lot of
maintain it.
land too.
A lot of land.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. well,
Maintenance and, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot of hard work.
Yeah, sure. We've got the hard work.
Well, maybe. Maybe not.
Or maybe exploiting others. That's another way you can get all that stuff. Or some combination of the two. So as I read this, it just makes me start to think that I'm wondering if there's more here than maybe we're being told. And I feel like that theme is going to go throughout the book, that there is more here than we're being told. And my sense is that this is the product of, I mentioned that maybe, that the theory is that there were maybe 2 authors, like this is an old folk tale, and then somebody wrote this poem in the middle. My own sense, and I think scholars are more coming to agree with it, is that this is probably the product of a single very skilled author who is able to write in different styles to achieve different results from the reader. And that I've heard this prologue described as having a false naivete about it. That it seems simple and straightforward, and it's maybe not. So that's my own take on
Takes
that.
a lot to tote 7,000 sheep.
Yeah, no kidding. It takes a lot.
You know,
I mean, somewhere along the line, you would think, was that 1 or 2?
Can I just stop and say a lot? Yeah, and save myself all the trouble.
That takes a lot of maintenance and work.
It sure
a lot
does,
of,
yeah.
You know,
Even with all the very many servants.
So his life
Who
must have
counts
been
them?
focused on, his obtaining his
Yeah.
wealth and status.
Yeah.
And, yeah, that's huge, really is.
Yeah.
I mean, even to feed them would be,
Kidding. That's, yeah.
acquiring, yeah.
And we don't really have his sense that maybe his sons help out with the family business. But mostly it seems like they're spending their time partying with each other, right?
Yeah.
At least that's what we hear about them. That's like the most important fact about them that we learn. Where things get really interesting, maybe is a kind way to put it, is in this next section that in our Bibles is labeled Attack on Job's Character. So verses 6 through 12 will give us a lot to talk about. So as we read this, think to yourself, see if you can notice what things seem out of place, odd, surprising, or just maybe even don't make sense to you. I think we'll come out of this passage with a lot of questions. And some of them we can talk about and answer, and some of them are just, wow, yeah, that's really strange, isn't it? So would someone read verses 6 through 12 for us? Thank you.
One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord and Satan. Excuse me. Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and looks away from evil. Then Satan answered the Lord, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
Thank you. So we get a peek behind the curtains here. We get to see beyond what we normally see in our world into the heavens. And there's a lot that's surprising here, isn't there? What do you first note that is surprising?
The heavenly beings.
The heavenly beings, yeah. So we see a few hints of this in the Hebrew Bible. In ancient Near Eastern religion around this time, the basic, what would you say, cosmology would be that there's one God and then there's a council of smaller gods around this person. So a lot of the Hebrew Bible maybe isn't monotheistic in the way that we think it is. It would be what you might refer to as henotheism, meaning that there is one God who is supreme, but there are still these other lesser gods. As Christianity develops, we come to think of these as angels. But I think right here, where the word is literally sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, so that these are lesser gods as part of the divine court. A lot of the Old Testament, if you look at it as how it historically develops, because remember it was written over, depending on how you count it, at least 1,000 years. And that we see gradually this movement from this view of the divine court to a really purely monotheistic, where there is only one God, and other gods are idols or false gods. So here we've got a remnant of that divine court with the heavenly beings. So yeah, that's the first thing that jumps out. One day, the heavenly beings. Who are these people? And there's one member of the heavenly beings who is most surprising of all, right? What is Satan doing here? Yeah.
Well, I'm trying, the way this reads, and I'm reading it a couple of different ways. Was Job protected by God?
It kind of sounds like
Yes,
that,
it
doesn't
does
it?
sound like it.
Yeah.
That's what Satan says
From
here.
Satan?
You have,
He's offered Satan, I mean, he's brought Satan
Yeah.
into the picture.
yeah. And so it sounds like Job's prosperity has come from God. That God has put what Satan calls a protective fence around him. So that he's protected from probably not only Satan, but from the world, from all the bad things that can happen. You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Yeah, so Job seems to have some protection from God.
If everything Job does comes out okay and good, he would not be as tempted as someone who was having a more difficult
Yeah.
type of life.
And I think that's really what Satan proposes here, is so it's easy to praise God and be upright all the time if everything goes right for you.
So does the author at some point question why Job protects his children?
I think there's going to be some questioning of that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then certainly this idea, what I think is really, really powerful and fascinating about that, how do I put it? That so Job is faithful. He praises God, believes in God, trusts God. Is it what we would call self-interested religion? we've all heard this formulation of Christianity from pastors at times, not here in this church, thankfully, that if you trust in God, good things will happen to you. Right? So this is why you should trust in God, because God looks out for the faithful believers. We know the world around us isn't that simple. But here, this is what Satan is saying, that everything works out well for Job. So God, is Job only a believer because things are good? And because he thinks that you'll continue to treat him well as long as he is faithful? That doesn't seem like a very good kind of faith. Does he fear God for nothing? Or is it because he thinks it's transactional, that belief gets good things? What we're really, my first Old Testament professor in seminary, Dr. Charles Mabey, made the statement that he thought if all we had left of the Old Testament were the books of Job and the book of Deuteronomy, books of Job and Deuteronomy, that would be enough. And I've spent years thinking about that. Deuteronomy posits what we call the deed's consequence nexus. We can see this most clearly in the final speech of Moses. I think it's chapter 31, where God, through Moses, says to the people that I have set two ways before you, the way of life and the way of death. You choose life so that you and your descendants may live. If you follow the laws, and it's a list of all the blessings that will happen to you if you follow these laws, if you continue to trust in God, and all these bad things that will happen to you if you don't. So the idea is that if you're righteous, you get good things. If you're wicked, you get bad things. That's really simple. What Job is saying all through, and what Satan is now kind of wheedling at, is there's maybe a problem with that. What do we see as the problem with that? I mean, I can think of a couple, but the most obvious one.
Why do bad things happen to good people?
Bad things happen to good people, and good things happen to bad people.
Yeah, that's right. It's called life.
So my reading of Job is that it's going to really complicate this and push on it. And maybe at the end come back to an idea that, let's see if we can nuance this a little bit. Not necessarily discard it, but maybe there's something to that, but it's maybe a little more complex than that. So that is Satan's question. Does Job fear God for nothing? What do you think about the relationship of God and Satan here in this passage? Is that one of the things that kind of surprises you?
Sound like they're bargaining.
Like they're bargaining?
Seems like they know each other pretty well.
They know each other pretty well. Satan is pretty welcome in God's court. They hang out together.
Yes.
Satan seems to have a job. He just kind of walks around, checks up on people, right? Yeah.
Who's available?
Who's available? So this is a kind of just a little, what would you say, a little strand of a really fascinating tradition. Just about everything we know about Satan doesn't come from the Old Testament. A little bit of it comes from the New Testament, and a lot of it comes from the church fathers afterwards and Dante's Inferno and writings like that. The Hebrew Satan means either adversary or accuser. And this person, there's a little note in your Bible that might say, or the accuser, Hebrew ha-Satan. The ha is the definite article in Hebrew. It means the. So this is not a name here. This isn't this guy's name. It says, so the accuser comes in. It's a title. It's a job description. I've read some scholars describe him as a prosecuting attorney for God. He's part of the divine court with a job to do. Another scholar argues that he's God's executioner throughout the Hebrew Bible. You know, like a king would have a royal executioner, and that's the role Satan plays. In the Old Testament, there are only a handful of places where we see the word Satan, Satan, and it's almost always, there's maybe one in Chronicles that people argue about, but it's almost always in this form of a title, or a descriptor rather than a name. It doesn't really become a name until a little bit before the New Testament. By the time we get to the New Testament, he's clearly a character. We see him tempting Jesus in the desert, and that's closer to what we know. We still don't have all the backstory and everything like that, but he's getting to this idea of the guy with the cape and the red horns and all that. But here, I don't think he's there yet. It's really in the service of God. He has a role to play, and he's doing that job. He is the accuser. I think that's just fascinating. That still doesn't explain why he disappears from the story after this. And why doesn't God just say, "Nah, I know Job. Job's a good guy. It's okay." That's not what God says. God says, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Why not? Let's go for it. So that portrayal of God is really upsetting. It's not the way I want to think of God at all.
I keep having a thought recurring when you use the word accuser. I'm thinking conscience.
It's a really interesting idea. That the part of Job that is giving those offerings all the time.
Well, I'm thinking the conscience of God.
The conscience of God. Oh, I like that even better. That's really neat. Yeah. So it almost does seem like the doubts that God has. Would that be another way to put it?
Yes.
God's saying, so I trust Job, but I'm not quite sure, and I want to be sure. Yeah. There was a fascinating TV series, maybe 15 years ago or so. It was on NBC for like one season before they canceled it, because it was a primetime cartoon called God, the Devil, and Bob. Bob was an auto worker in Detroit, and it's really the story of Job, where God and the devil decide if there's anything worth saving in humanity, and this guy Bob becomes the person that they both place a wager on. If God can find anything worthwhile in Bob, then maybe humanity's okay. You can see why it didn't do very well on network television.
Prime time.
Tim Curry is the voice of Satan. So, God, is it fair to say God accepts the wager? He at least relents and says, okay, Satan, give it a try. Right now, it's only his possessions, which in the biblical times will include his family members, which is something that really causes us problems today, that his children are not the same as his house. So is there more to say about that, or is that we ready to move on to see where things go from here?
When God says, do not stretch out your hand against him, what do you believe that means?
Yeah, I think we're making a distinction between all that he has is in your power. So here, Satan can destroy his house, he can take his flocks away, he can even kill his children, but don't touch Job's body himself. And we're going to see that changes later on. Yeah. So we have this narrative here about all these things happening at the same time. I feel like here we can, verse 13 is, given the conversation we've just had, the way this scene is introduced is interesting. One day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, so we're both foreshadowing that the children are all going to be killed together in the same accident. But I think we're also hearkening back to is this all these guys do? This is kind of all the information we have about them is that they seem to eat and drink together a lot. So here we're introducing this story by them eating and drinking again. The oxen were plowing and the donkeys are killed by raiders. The servants are killed by these same raiders. A fire came and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. Then the Chaldeans, yet another group of armies, comes, makes a raid on the camels and killed the servants who are managing them. And now it seems that we keep seeing while he was still speaking. So like we've got this idea that all these messengers are coming and they don't even have a chance to finish their message before we get more bad news. So it's really bad news on top of bad news on top of bad news on top of bad news. This fourth messenger has to reiterate again, your sons and daughters, now I'm in verse 18, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across, and now the house collapses and kills the family. So here's Job's famous response to this. Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So that line, the Lord gave, the Lord's taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord, that's one that we hear a lot. One of the lines that gets pulled from Job and used in many, many different contexts. That's certainly Job the patient, isn't it? Mm-hmm. 22 is an important verse because we're going to compare it with a verse a little bit later. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing.
Imagine that.
Yeah, that's kind of amazing, isn't it? So put a pin in that so we can compare what that actually says. He did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Well, before we move on, one question that brings to mind, or for me, that seems to imply that sinning is one thing and charging God with wrongdoing is something different. So it almost says that charging God with wrongdoing is not sin. That's okay. And yeah, Job would be in a heap of trouble if that was not okay, because that's what he's going to do for most of the rest of the book, starting in chapter 3. So, but put a pin in verse 22 there, because we're going to come back to that in a little bit.
So any type of retaliation on Job's part, he would have sinned. He would have been classified as sinning.
Kind of seems like that, yeah.
Because
yeah.
it was against God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the book is then going to complicate that, I think, especially as we get
I thought
to.
that was, yeah.
You probably, yeah. I hardly need to say that
I
anymore.
remember,
'cause
yeah.
Just everything. Yep, the book's going to complicate that. Oh yeah, that too. Yep, that one also. Yep, that one. Yeah. So here we have. This book is often structured in either 2s or 3s, and here we have this kind of neat pairing where we've seen the first scene in the heavenly realm, and now we're going to see another that's almost the same. Someone want to read verses in chapter 2, verses 1 through 6.
One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from making up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He will persist in his integrity, although you incite the others against him to destroy him for no reason. Then Satan answered the Lord, skin for skin. All that people have, they will give to save their lives. But stretch not your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well, he is in your power, only spare his life.
Thank you. So you notice the first, like, 4 verses are almost identical to the first scene, like word for word. There's just a small addition that where present himself before the Lord is the only real difference. In that God, the Devil, and Bob, there's one episode where Bob wakes up and there are bowls all over his room. And he like wakes up and knocks over a pile and is stumbling. And then we cut down to Satan in the underworld looking like this. And his assistant is laughing and Satan says, I said boils.
Oh,
That's a classic play. But look at him. I mean, he's tripping on him. And
Now, what was that in?
it's this
In the movie.
called God, the Devil, and Bob, this TV show that was
The
on
one that
15
you
or 20
were
years
referring
ago.
to.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we do learn some new things here, though, right? God is still happy with how Job has responded. He still persists in his integrity. Although you incited me against him, I love him trying to put the blame on Satan there. You incited me against him for no reason. It's your fault. But Satan thinks that, well, if we just push him a little bit harder, then we'll see that he really is only upright and just because life is pretty good. So if we push him a little bit harder, he will curse you to your face. And God agrees to that too. And so Satan comes out and inflicts loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And Job then is going to go outside the village and sit among the ashes, because not only is he in great pain, but he's unclean. So he has to leave the village, leave his house. He's following the Levitical laws and going to the outskirts of the community. So he's not only in terrible discomfort, is far too weak, but he's a pariah as well. He's also a social outcast. But now we're going to have this interesting character of Job's wife. She only gets a couple verses here in the Hebrew. It's interesting, in the Greek, she has a much longer speech in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And we don't know if that's that the Hebrew was originally longer and it somehow got lost, or if a translator of the Septuagint thought maybe she should have more to say and wrote a longer speech. St. Augustine referred to her as Satan's helpmeet in one of his writings. See if you think that's fair. So this is just verses 9 through 10. Then Job's wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Something's different there at the end, right? Go back to the verse that we put a pin in earlier. In all this, Job did not what in verse 122?
Sin or charge God.
Sin or charge God with wrongdoing. What's different here in verse 2:10? In all this, Job did not.
Sin with his lips.
He might be thinking about it.
Right.
That's sure how I read that. That he's not saying things, but he's sure got a running commentary in his head. I can't blame him for that at all.
No.
I think his wife recognizes that.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
wants him to bet.
There's kind of a. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
There's kind of a funny interpretive crux. You might have a footnote when she says, curse God and die. The Hebrew is literally bless. The thinking was that the rabbis could not bring themselves to write curse God, even when it's being put in the lips of advice that you're not supposed to take. So there have been all this writing about, is that fair? Could they really have meant bless God and die? Because that would be her saying, say something nice and then resign yourself, give up, and it's okay. Curse God and die kind of says, be a rebel and then take the punishment that's going to come to you from the divine. So those are really different ways to look at it. I often wonder if Job is written to allow us to have both options and not necessarily choose between them. Or at least leave open both of those possibilities. If she says, bless God and die, she's almost sympathetic, right? If she says, curse God and die, I read her as angry and bitter and... Yeah. So I think both possibilities are there. Although somehow Job doesn't like what she's saying. Speak as any foolish woman would speak does not make me think more highly of Job. But his follow-up statement, shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? What do you think about that as a statement of faith?
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's a good one, right? Although I keep coming back to me that almost, I feel like in my own life that's a really helpful way to look at it. That we have good things, we have bad things, God's with us. When bad things happen, it's not God's fault.
That's the one to really hang on to.
Yeah, yeah.
Never blame God.
Yeah. But here with Job, it is God's fault. Because we read it. Because God said to Satan, yeah, sure, go ahead. You can do this.
Are we supposed to assume God's hands are clean because he allowed Satan to do it?
I wonder if we are. And there's so one of the books I'm working on is an edited volume that's called the Oxford Handbook of Biblical Monsters. And it's got about 30 different chapters from some really amazing biblical scholars, each writing about a different monster in the biblical text. And one of them is about Satan. Ryan Stokes is the author of that. And a lot of his theory is that, so we have this movement that we talked about from the divine court to having only one God. If you have only one God, evil is a real problem. We've heard the philosophical formulation that it's not possible to have a God who is both all-powerful and all-loving when you have evil in the world.
Sorry, Brandon.
No problem, no problem.
I had it turned off.
Brandon, a time for another talk or
Yeah.
thought, but
Yeah, please.
I think of Judas and Judas's life
Yeah.
and how it's going with Job and how did that all intertwine, and I see a parallel.
I think there are lots of parallels, and fascinatingly enough, people have also seen parallels between Job and Jesus in all that Job suffered. to have this encounter with God and this revelation.
It's something that you said about that God is doing this to Job.
Yeah.
I thought it was more like God is allowing the devil to do this to Job.
Yeah. So that was where I was kind of going. And is that distinction? How much does that make you feel better? If God isn't doing it but is only allowing it to happen. It's clearly we're trying to put more of it on this character, the accuser, or what we would think of as the devil. Because really we see the devil rise as a character as monotheism becomes more important, as a way to solve that problem of evil. Sometimes I wonder if it really solves it, though. Or if we say that God still allows this to happen, I'm still, the question is moved back, but I still ask, okay, so why did you allow it to happen? So for me, one of the things this book is doing is kind of cannily pushing on those questions. In some ways, it does try to absolve God of responsibility for it by saying, Satan, you were the one who incited me against Job for no reason. But Job's not going to buy that. Job spends chapters 3 through 31 accusing God pretty directly of attacking him. There are passages in here where Job laments that, God, I don't need you to be nice to me. I'd just like you to leave me alone. Can you just stop paying attention to me? That would be great. Which is so painful. So painful. So I feel like this book is really, really trying to push back on those ideas of how much can we absolve God of blame for these questions. For me, one of the things that makes me keep coming back to Job, sometimes I wish it gave me more answers to those questions. Mm-hmm. But I think it is so important that it tells me that those questions are okay. And as in a couple of weeks, there's a spoiler. After the divine speech, God has spent 3 verses kind of haranguing Job, or 3 chapters, not 3 verses, 4 whole chapters, telling Job that he had everything wrong and he doesn't understand a thing. But then says somehow Job is the one who spoke rightly. And there have been all these scholarly backflips to try to say, well, God just meant when Job repented at the end. And that's not what I see. I see that maybe Job was wrong through all this, but he still in some way spoke rightly by asking the questions. I really, really see this entire book as permission, encouragement even, to ask those questions, even when they're uncomfortable. And I admire that so deeply. I almost wonder if that is maybe being, this is a good space to be personal and vulnerable. If that is one of the things that has kept me in the Christian tradition through my life, is this understanding that asking these questions is okay. And I've always gravitated towards churches that have that understanding. That this is a space to say maybe we don't have all the answers, but asking questions is part of what we're supposed to do. You remember how, this is a digression, but it's a really fun one, and it might be worth a whole session sometime next year. Do you know how Israel got its name as a nation? It comes from the story where Jacob is wrestling with either God or an angel at the shore of the river. They wrestle all night. Jacob refuses to let go until he gets a blessing. This divine being then taps him on the hip so that he's got a limp for the rest of his life and says, your new name is Israel. So it's in the Hebrew, Hebrew is mostly consonants.
Right.
So the L is God. Yasar means to wrestle with. Because Jacob was just wrestling with God all night long. So his name is now Wrestle with God. And that becomes the name of the people who our tradition is founded upon, wrestle with God. I view that as almost a calling statement, that what we are called to do is wrestle with God and not let go until we get our blessing. Sometimes it hurts and we might walk away with a limp, but we are called to do that wrestling. So hopefully that's a interesting digression. In verse 11 of chapter 2, the three friends finally show up on the scene. Would someone read just 11 through 13?
Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite.
Sorry, I didn't mean to give you all
You're fine.
the names in your verse.
Well, if I say them wrong, you can correct me. Bildad the Shuhite,
The Shuhite, yeah.
and Zophar the Naamathite.
The Namathite, yeah, good.
They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great.
Thank you. So the dust and ashes are really going to come into play in 2 weeks from now, but we've got a little bit. So Job is sitting on an ash heap, and we've got the dust thrown in the air here. So we have our first instance of dust and ashes, at least in kind of close proximity to each other. What do you think about the friends just here?
True friendship,
What makes you say that? I agree. Yeah.
being able to sit with him for 7 days and 7 nights without challenging, cursing, lamenting or
Yeah.
anything, just being there
Just
with
being
him.
there. Yes. Most of the book, they're going to be really terrible examples of pastoral care that they'll be arguing with them. But here, this is a great example. One of the first things you learn in pastoral care classes and classes about how to be with people in the hospital, how to talk with people in crisis, is what's called a ministry of presence. That what people need most is for you to be there. They don't need answers. If you try to give them answers, everything you say is going to be wrong and not helpful. But they do need you to be there with them. And the other thing they do is lament along with him. That they're in grief with him. And that's really, really wonderful. I remember when I first came to seminary, my idea was I wanted to study this because I wanted to learn the right words to say. I wanted to learn how to preach the best sermon that would help us all understand things. I wanted to learn what words would fix things. And it was took me a while to get my mind around the idea that it's not about the right words. You have to do things because we expect sermons, and we all get things out of sermons. But the real work of community happens in the presence, in the being with each other, not in the right words. So this, to me, is a really poignant and powerful example of that. They sat with him. They sit with him for a whole week, even. There might be some exaggeration there. That's okay, though, right? Sometimes we're busy enough that if we can give someone an hour with them, that is enough for a week. But now we suddenly have our shift into poetry. We have this, now we're in color. We've landed in Oz, or Ooze. There's a fantastic article called Dorothy and the Wizard in Ooze that's comparing the Book of Job and the Wizard of Oz in really fascinating ways. Todd Linnefeld, Dorothy and the Wizard of Ooze. So we can really, if we go just through verse 10, we'll get a good idea of what this lament looks like. We can start from there and see if we want to go on a little bit more. But if someone would just read through verse 10, that would give us a good start.
In chapter 3,
Yeah.
after this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Job said, "Let the day perish in which I was born, and the night that said a man-child is conceived, let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, or light shine on it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let the clouds settle upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice amongst the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Yes, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry be heard in it. Let those cursed who curse the sea, those who are killed who rise up against Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none. May it not see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb and hide trouble from my eyes."
Thank you. He's really unloading here, right? He's been keeping this stuff in for a while, and here it all comes out. So I have spent so much time working through that line, let those who curse it curse the sea, those who are skilled to rouse up Leviathan. I don't think it's an accident that Leviathan shows up here in Job's lament, and then in a couple of weeks when we look at God's divine speech, Leviathan's going to get a whole chapter about how amazing and overwhelming this creature is. Also, may it, the day, not see the eyelids of the morning, right in the next verse. That's a really unusual poetic phrase. There's only one other time in the Bible where the phrase the eyelids of the morning are used. It's when God describes Leviathan's eyes in chapter 41. I find that just fascinating. There are all kinds of echoes in God's speech at the end to the rest of the book.
Well, he also blames his mother.
He blames his mother, yeah.
For being there.
For being there, for giving birth to him, right? Because he would rather not be. And he's willing to say he wants this entire day of his birth just gone from the calendar. Mm-hmm. Like he wants everything on that day to be obliterated. A really wonderful Jewish scholar, Michael Fishbane, has referred to this as an uncreation hymn. And he talks about how much there's like gloom and deep darkness, that's the beginning of there was gloom and deep darkness, it's tohu vavohu in the beginning of Genesis 1. There are so many connections to Genesis 1 and the creation story, and this is moving backwards through them. Which is, I think, just really, really brilliant and fun. So he wants this whole day gone. Not only is he, how do you read that? Like, why does he care so much about the day of his birth?
Everything else has been erased from his life,
Yeah,
and yet he still exists.
yeah.
He would rather not go on
Yeah.
in lament.
And it almost seems like he wants to take a lot with him when he goes.
Yeah.
Not just enough to have me wiped out, I'm going to take everything with me too. Take this whole day. So it really is moving from his individual self to something a lot larger. We're talking about the calendar. We're talking about the world and the clouds, the gloom and darkness. The sea comes in here at the end. So his despair is so large that it's not enough just for him to be erased. He wants everything gone. So this is not Job the patient, is it? What do you think about this lament here? Has he still followed up? Well, what is he still holding on to his integrity, as God and Satan were talking about earlier?
I think he's kind of like given up.
It really sounds like that, doesn't
I
it?
think
Yeah.
I don't know, to me that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
I don't think I think he still trusts in God, but
Yeah.
he doesn't understand why all this is happening.
Yeah. We can sure understand that emotion, right? I don't hold him.
He's experiencing a lot of grief,
Yeah.
loss.
There's so much grief in this poem.
He's just a man. You know,
So what Satan says, stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. He's cursing the day, but he hasn't cursed God, right? And then later, after in the second encounter between Satan and God in chapter 2, the Satan says, stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. We still haven't seen him curse God, right? But at the end in chapter 2, verse 10, it says, in all this Job did not sin with his lips. So are we to think that he has sinned with his lips here? Or not? It's certainly not, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, blessed be the name of the Lord. It's a little different from that. But has he sinned at this point? Has he done anything wrong here?
No, he's just
I don't
music.
think so, yeah. That tends to be that's how I read it too. That this is still, he's angry, he's grieving. Later in this lament, he says, well, this is really interesting in verse 23, later in the lament. The lament is so long that we won't have time to get through all of it, but verse 23 is a really important one. Why is light given to one who cannot see the way, whom God has fenced in? Where have we had language about fencing in before?
Satan accused God of fencing it in and keep fencing
Yeah.
everything that he had in so that it was safe.
It was a protective fence. God has made a protective fence around you, is what Satan says. But here, Job laments that he has been fenced in by his sorrows, by his lamenting. It's a different kind of fencing. It's one of those things that, because, Job clearly didn't hear God and Satan talking about that. We know that. This is one of those things that makes me think the author who's overseeing this is really wanting to get these connections in here and wanting us to think through these ideas. That fencing can work both ways. Fencing can be protective, and it can be confining. Later on in this is another lament of Job's from chapter 7. Job laments to God, am I the sea or the dragon that you set a guard over me? So it's another one of those images of you're guarding, are you guarding me? Am I that important that you have to be watching me all the time?
Stop.
Interestingly, the dragon is another name for Leviathan.
I knew it was going to be here somewhere.
That's why I'm so fascinated with Leviathan. This guy keeps showing up
Yeah.
as the cosmic enemy of God. That's what Job is saying there. Am I your cosmic enemy that you have to be guarding me this closely? So we have just a few minutes left before we have to pause for a couple of weeks. Next week I'm going to be in North Carolina giving a lecture on this book that's going to be coming out. So you guys have kind of given me a chance to work through some of the stuff and talk through some of it a little bit. I appreciate that.
Glad we can help out.
Yeah, thank you. So I do wonder though, because I think one of the questions that we have that I think is really interesting to look at is how the friends respond to these laments of Job. We've looked at, or we've mentioned this kind of deeds consequence idea that God and Satan are talking about in some ways too. This idea that, is Job only good because he thinks good things will happen to him if he's good? If he is faithful to you, good things happen. If bad things happen to him, is he still faithful? So how do the friends, what Job is saying is, look, I did the right thing and bad things happened to me. So throughout the book, we'll see Job demanding, I want to hear from God, what did I do wrong? If I did something wrong, you deserve this, one. Or two, what do I not understand? And when God comes finally the answer, God's going to not answer number one, but answer number two, and say the answer is a lot, in short. But I think it's interesting to see how the friends respond to this. So as we remember in here, verses 4 through 27 are their wisdom debates. So they start with Eliphaz gives a speech. Job responds. Bildad gives a speech. Job responds. And then, I'm blanking out on the Zophar speaks and Job responds. And they do that, they go through that cycle 3 times, but the third time it's broken. Starts around 25, 26, it kind of breaks down a little bit. And for a while, some scholars have thought either something was missing in the text, that we lost the last speech, or maybe there's also some proposals to rearrange things so that we can reconstruct the speeches. Scholar Carol Newsom has suggested that is representative of the communication breaking down, that the third cycle is incomplete because they're not talking to each other anymore. I kind of like that idea. But let me read you just a little bit of Eliphaz's speech. So the friends have been silent for 7 weeks, or 7 days, we should keep this in mind. They've sat and lamented with Job for 7 days. And then Job just like out of the blue unleashes this tirade about the day of his birth and how everything should be wiped out and taken off from the calendar. So then in verse 4, Eliphaz is the first one to respond. So this is a response to Job's lament. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, if one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? Yeah, chapter 4, the very beginning there. I apologize, sorry, sometimes I don't mean to move too quickly. Chapter 4, Eliphaz's first speech. And Eliphaz the Temanite answered, if one ventures a word with you, will you be offended? But who can keep from speaking? So let me pause there just for a little bit. How do you read this introduction? How is Eliphaz starting his speech? How is he approaching Job?
We just listened to all that stuff that
Yeah,
Job said, and
yeah.
now he said, I can't keep this in.
Yeah.
I gotta say something.
Can we talk a little bit here? He's also very polite. If one ventures a word with you, will you be offended?
He's sensitive.
He's really trying. And it's kind of funny as you read through the speeches, you see these introductory lines become more and more harsh as they go along.
Listen,
like finally there, like at one point Job says to he calls the friends worthless comforters, and he says they have nothing but wind. And at one point Zophar just starts his speech with "Pay attention." That they get less and less kind to each other as they're moving along. But here's how Eliphaz starts. See, you have instructed many. You have strengthened the weak hands. Your words have supported those who were stumbling, and you have made firm the feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? So Eliphaz is saying here, you've comforted so many people. So we're starting to get a little more of a sense of how other people feel Job, or receive Job, how they relate to him. That maybe it's not just all
He didn't just
crops
live
and
within the
land and,
fence.
Well,
yeah, he didn't just live within the fence. That's good, I like that. That he's been a comforter. But now it's coming to you. So there's kind of this sense that maybe everybody gets a turn. Although I don't know that most of us have a turn like Job had. That was quite a turn. But now he's going to make a theological argument here. I'm starting in verse 7. Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the breath of God they perish, and by the blast of his anger they are consumed. The roar of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. The strong lion perishes for lack of prey, and the whelps of the lioness are scattered. What's his theological argument here? It's basically this, right?
Yes.
Who that was innocent ever perished? So what he's going to go on to say is basically there are two ways you can respond to this, Job. You can trust that you haven't really done anything wrong, so that things are going to turn around for you. Or you can search yourself and figure out what you did wrong and start repenting for it. How do you receive that argument? How would you receive that argument as someone in the throes of grief like Job?
I think you have to go back to the fact that they sat with him
Yeah,
to begin with.
that's a good way
These
to
are
look at
really,
it.
truly good friends who care deeply, or they would not have stayed with him.
And that they've maybe bought themselves some credibility by doing that. That you can argue with someone after you've sat with them for 7 days, huh? I like that. That's a nice way to look at it. Because they're clearly starting to push back here and say, look, you're missing the point, Job. You're not getting it. One of the things Eliphaz is going to say later, this is in verses 12 through 21, his argument is basically, he talks about having a dream, which is interesting in itself, because usually knowledge in a book like Job, what we would call a wisdom book, knowledge comes from experience, not from dreams. This is one of the only times where we see that in Job, that knowledge comes from like this kind of revelation. But he says that in this dream, he sees he feels a spirit, and he can't quite see it, but he hears it say, can mortals be righteous before God? Can human beings be pure before their maker? Kind of this idea that, okay, we heard Job was just and upright from the narrator in the beginning, but can people really be just and upright before God? Eliphaz says no. So if you have bad things happen to you, you must have deserved it, because none of us are just and upright before God. I'm not a huge fan of that theology myself, the we all deserve bad things argument. Although it does make me wonder if in some ways Eliphaz comes strongly from the Reformed tradition. There's a little bit of that in there. So that's one of the arguments that the friends are going to be making. That, no, Job, you aren't really just and upright. The other argument that they're going to keep coming back to is, this is one that we've heard as well, that you got to be patient. Good things will eventually happen to you. Job continues to reject all of those arguments and calls us back to his experience, which is, no, I haven't done anything to deserve this, and if I did, I don't know what it is. And if there's any kind of justice, I should at least know, right? And then Job will more and more get frustrated with this throughout the book. Talk about the wealthy people he sees who continue to sin and mock God, and still get good things, and the righteous who are in states like Job. So that's kind of where we are through the book. And I'm mindful of our time together today. Where I'm hoping to go with this in a couple of weeks is we'll maybe look at a few representative times where there are a couple of key passages throughout where Job requests an audience with God. And I think looking at a couple of those is really helpful because Job has some pretty clear requests of God. This is what I want from you. And then we'll look at the divine speeches and spend most of the time looking at how God responds and ask, so did God live up to what Job asked of him or not? And then how is God's answer to these questions different from what we've heard here? How does God square the circle of deed's consequence? Or is it just completely unrelated? Because I think that's another possibility. But for me, the book is too tightly constructed for me to really want to buy that seriously. I want to see it as emerging from these discussions and being a response to them, even if it's a response that in some way drives me crazy because I want it to be a clearer answer.
All these different perspectives.
Yeah. I do think the deep wisdom of the book of Job and of much of the Bible is that it recognizes that answers from our human perspective are always limited. And that being asked questions, being shown different answers, and having our ideas of what's possible expanded is always more powerful than having an answer that tries to button things up and give us a clear, concise way to go forward. It's much more frustrating than if we had clear answers. But I think it's also the reason we keep reading this book thousands of years later, because it continues to ask us to reflect on the world and ourselves in ways that don't get exhausted. I'm sure I have read 30 or 40 books on Job, and we can continue finding new ways to understand this and new ways to reflect on it, and new ways for Job to speak to where we are today. So I hope you'll be able to join me in 2 weeks where I'll give you all the, okay.
Yeah, right.
We'll not give you all the answers, but where we can continue to look at how this book moves with those answers and works with them. Should we close together in prayer and then go off into the beautiful sun of today? Please be with me in prayer. Well, gracious God, thank you again for this day and for this time together. Please help us to continue meditating on these words that we have read together, on the thoughts we have shared, on the ideas that we have talked about with one another. Help us to find meaning in those words, ideas, exchanges, ways that we might think more deeply about you, about the world, about each other. We are so grateful for this time to spend with your word and with all the richness and complexity you have put in it for us to continue to wrestle with. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Don't erase.